Perfect. Good morning, and welcome to our fourth webinar in this series. And these will all be available online for you to enjoy at a later date. But we have really, over these past 4 to 5 weeks, really taken a new direction in what was shocking to us, what was unsettling and out of control with the outbreak of COVID so quickly expanding, really left us, many of us, in a state of confusion and fear. And so those first few meetings were really just one to build community, to come together. And the second meeting was immediate business needs, how to take care of employees, how to temporarily close down your business, best methods for communicating with customers, investors, banks. And then we moved from there into the specific mechanics of operations for the cannabis and hemp industry, particularly in those states that have a robust legal, those that have a robust legal presence and is recognized now as an essential business, which has really just transformed the industry very quickly for us, with the credibility and the professionalism that we have all been working towards for many years, those of us that have been in this world. But it really kind of opened up and started to really take down those barriers and those walls around stigmatization, and understanding that this is medicine, that this is a alternative to other forms of escape, or dealing with pain, whether those are opioids, alcohol, or other unfortunate things that that do not, live a lifestyle that now we're starting to adapt to. So that last one was really focused on everything from implementing a crisis management plan, how to mitigate the supply chain disruptions that may affect your business, how to work with your frontline employees no matter where they are in the system, and then how do you come out of that in the next phase of this, of really planning for the future. So with that piece coming in, this is the next part of that. Today's conversation is taking us to another place. It is bringing us into a location of, now, I'm adapting, and adapting is the word that we need to use here. No longer planning, we need to adapt. So how do I've adapted my personal life to be somewhat in isolation, to be in my home, to be, monitoring things from afar, to be having new ways of creating and being in contact with people. But where is that going to happen, and how is that going to be altered over time, and how do I need to be thinking about that in the realm of my day-to-day life and my future business life? And so this is the next part of that conversation, and I'm really honored to have my new friend and colleague, Ruth Tuvian, on here today, who is just really one of these thought leaders, and really has guided many of the top companies in the world through conversations about where is the point of engagement? What is it exactly that my business does? How does it fit into a value, a mission, a brand, a future relationship, a product line, all the things that whatever your business is. And how does that, but now that things are different and they're not going to actually go back to being the same, what do I need to think about going forward? And so that is the point of today's conversation. It is, there's so much, interaction that we're creating with this conversation, that we have put this in 2 parts. So today is the introduction and the start of this process, and then we want to bring everyone back together again on Tuesday at the same time and finish this up, because that's really the harder work. We want to give you a lot of stuff to start with, and then we want to take you to the end of this. I do recommend that if you have a pen and pencil handy, even though it's kind of old school, or however you take your notes today, you might want to have that handy, one, just to be able to capture some of the thoughts, but also to start working on some of the the concepts that we're going to present today. And then towards the end of this, we will unmute and open up for a Q&A session. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn this over to Ruth, who's going to tell you a little bit more about herself, but then bring us into this conversation and really help us dig a little deeper into thinking about what comes next. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Meryl. I'm excited to be here today and also with you next Tuesday. This is a stakeholder remapping workshop. I usually call it just the stakeholder mapping workshop. And I typically run it with innovation teams or teams who are involved in some kind of pivot or change, where when it's business as usual, you have stakeholders that know that they're your stakeholders, but when it's business not as usual, which is pretty much everyone right now, it requires strategies for purposeful engagement so that your new stakeholders realize that they're your new stakeholders. Because when a change happens or a pivot happens, there's some new stakeholders you need to engage in the process in whatever kind of change or shift that you're creating, and you need new people on board to support that, or new groups or organizations. It's really important to engage and not assume that they know that they're your new stakeholders. So with that, I just want to share before we jump in a little bit about how stakeholder engagement became my superpower. And I would love if you could think about how it could become or is already one of your superpowers. So I've worked with many large corporations and startups. I typically have worked in roles where I'm working with maybe two or multiple stakeholders that don't speak the same language. They might speak English, or they might speak Portuguese or Spanish, or they might all speak English, but they're not speaking the same kind, whether it comes to acronyms or industry terminology. Their interests are different. Their constraints are definitely often different, and their motivation is different. And so how do you not only bring all those stakeholders to the table and move them in a direction, but how do you move them through a change or a shift or something new, a product? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Meryl, I thought it would be nice if you kind of share a little bit about how stakeholder engagement is one of your superpowers too, before we jump in.
So, I am one of those crazy people that look at things in a variety of different ways. And, it comes in different formats. One is, you read an article and you see something about someone or a company, and you just make a note of it because there's something in that that's going to come back and be of interest at a later date. You don't know exactly where that is. And that kind of thought process is also how I go about looking not only at the business that Rhiannon and I created here, but also how we engage with the people that we work with, right? And so we often are looking, what are the different relationships that we're creating here? And how does that affect decision making? How does that affect innovation? How does that affect product development? And right now, as I said, a lot of work, particularly on the CPG side of things, is really just about fulfillment, right? Distribution is a big piece of this, just getting things from point A to point B to point C, and this, and a lot of it's going direct to the consumer versus. But so the first few weeks of this pandemic has been just around basic needs, right? Toilet paper, flour, sugar, coffee, milk, right? And we stopped looking at all the other things that we like, such as, the granola or the power bars, or, different things that we would normally put in our cart. And so that has really said, oh, well, okay, what do I do about my new products I was launching? What do I do about the innovation, the things that we're working on? And so those first few weeks was just about fulfillment and stopping. And now it is about going, bringing those things back. The relationships are different. The relationship with the buyer, they too have just been in shock. They don't want to see something new. But this is the time during this process that we look at stakeholders. And so stakeholders are my employees. Stakeholders are, my friends and family. Stakeholders are my investors, my bankers. but they are also, now that my consumer has changed and their buying habits are changed, what does that mean? What does that mean to the products? The products that I thought were awesome before might have to shift a little to fit into this new world. So that's the superpowers that I look at when I look at the stakeholder. It's just all the different relationships to the questions I'm asking about what am I doing?
Right. I think particularly because trust sits in the middle of the industry, it's important to have that superpower. So a few key considerations. This is obviously in two parts. So we cannot about considerations in today's environment. This is something that we just added in to give a little bit of context. A few important definitions. I like to say that the stakeholder terminology is oftentimes the Brussels sprouts of business strategy. It's been there for a long time. It had its fad within the business world, and now people just think, oh yeah, it's a dime a dozen stakeholders. Of course, I'm thinking about that. But we make a lot of assumptions, I've learned, when we don't take the time to map out our stakeholders. And that's why I started this workshop for my own team when I was leading teams and for clients, is because when we don't take the time to map that out, we start making assumptions about who they are, who their stakeholders are. We don't take the time to validate or look at it from a big picture. Stakeholder mapping is also a creative and a strategic exercise. And so we cannot be strategic if we don't have the whole picture right in front of us to start connecting the dots and seeing patterns and see how we might create some efficiencies even in our business strategy through looking at our stakeholders. So oftentimes, well, I don't need to, I know what a stakeholder is. It's the Brussels sprouts of business strategy. But this is really an opportunity for you to step back and take some time and actually commit pen to paper, keyboard to computer, or just start thinking in your brain and making some space for that. So we're going to go through the definition of what a stakeholder is and why we even care. And then today we'll start identifying your stakeholders. And when we identify them, we'll prioritize them. We'll start to understand stakeholder audiences, and I'll give everyone an exercise that you can do over the next week before we meet again. And then the really meaty prize at the end will be strategies for engaging your stakeholders. So I could give you those strategies now, but if you don't have a map and you don't understand who your prioritized stakeholders are, you will be overwhelmed with the amount of strategies that are available to start engaging with your stakeholders. So it's really important that you build up to that process. Okay, but first we're going to take, I think about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, just to understand the pivoting in uncertain times. So it's more than just face masks. We've likely all heard about different manufacturers, whether it's bedding or this is a mattress company, fashion companies are all pivoting to see if they can change their production into masks to meet consumer demand. But it's more than just that. We are also seeing vision care turning lenses into face shields. We're seeing fitness instructors going online and gyms becoming virtual gyms. We're seeing universities offering online sessions and online degrees. We're seeing co-working spaces even shift to virtual networking and trying to recreate and add value to people as they're trying to still network in this time. We're also seeing augmented reality companies who have been working on gaming kind of pivot into online trials of products to create that sort of certainty for purchasing that has really been put on pause. And then, of course, we're taking a cannabis ban. We haven't fully recognized that yet here on this stakeholder mapping workshop. So we're seeing in this uncertain time where it's not okay to puff, puff, pass, that joints are being turned into mini joints, that the messaging and marketing has changed, and that bud tenders are being trained to be in the delivery business, not just in the kind of hospitality on-site at dispensaries. So these are some of the changes that are happening. Meryl, just want to give us 3 or 4 minutes on some other key considerations in today's environment as we're thinking about pivoting before we jump into the stakeholder mapping?
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, thank you for that great introduction to this. It's, oh, excuse me. You know, one of the things that we forget is, um, you know, right now, because we've been forced inward, we are this adaptation. I can't kind of stress that enough, right? So we have had to adapt so many different things: how we grocery shop, how we, what we're purchasing, things that, you know, were luxuries, we're looking at very differently right now, right? So the cost of things have become very more nuanced in just around, I'm not sure what's going to happen next. So even for those that are most secure financially at this point in time, there's a lot of disruption in that, right? So it's everyone stopping to think, which also then turns into what is different and what is going to be different. So I love this analogy between particularly in the cannabis and the dispensary relationship, because you're going to show some great examples as we go through this process about how some of those changes were already kind of in place, but this kind of really magnified it. And that we really, you know, have, you know, in this uncertain time, this ability now to just take a deeper dive and look in closer to where do we want to be? How do we want to be? And what comes out of this going forward? And that I'm very optimistic about. You know, things will never go back, but that's okay. It opens up for what's next. And what's next doesn't necessarily have to be unsettling. It can be full of creativity, and we're going to touch that. So I'm looking forward to getting into this a little more.
Yeah, I think it's important to think through some of these questions about, you know, will you even be able to reopen, or some of your partners? And so when you're mapping out your stakeholders, you can start to answer these questions. So this can really come in anytime in the process. The stakeholder mapping can allow you to see where you might need to pivot, or vice versa. You can make the pivot now, create some innovations, and then see how it impacts your stakeholders. So this is, you know, you can take a look, read through these, and I think most importantly, what innovations do you need to stay in business? And so with that last question, this is again, going back to the definition, what is innovation? It's the ability to anticipate disruptive forces and transform through successive incremental iterations. It's not necessarily about the big swoop. So that's something to keep in mind. And having come from corporate innovation, many times we would see the startup ecosystem as a laboratory for culture and technological innovation. And I think the cannabis industry, being one big startup, is an open laboratory. So it's really important to also see what is happening in that ecosystem and in that laboratory outside of your own dashboard, because you may have joints sales on your dashboard, but the global view of cannabis has mini joints and edibles and other products. So it's important that when you innovate, you look at the entire global dashboard, not just your company's dashboard. So this is from kind of an overview. Again, this is just to give you some context around innovation. So it's driven by changing expectations, cultural and technological, and customers are constantly changing, but changing even more so. So that's why the innovation angle is really important. This, like I said, is a whole other exercise in itself, but I wanted to share this with everybody. This is kind of a step you might take to understand trends. So this is from a trend mapping workshop, but I thought some of these questions I would just kind of throw up here so that you can consider them as you're making changes. And maybe at some point we can have another session on this. But when you think about what's next, think about who are your next buyers. Again, for the mattress companies that are switching to face masks, they're going to have to start thinking about the new personas. What are your core assets, and how is that shifting? And then on the process and product side, a little bit more obvious, but is your means of production having to change in this time? Is your actual product changing?
One thing real quick, just the way that I think the navigation of us on the side here, just on this side, if you can just talk to what's on here, particularly because I'm not sure everyone can see that right side of the screen.
Oh,
so
yes. So So these are 4 quadrants that we look at when we're responding to market shifts. So I'll give an example outside of cannabis. When we look at the hospitality industry and we look at boutique design firms, and they're trying to respond to what was once the experience economy, and now they'll have to see how they can respond to the virtual experience economy. But we would look at things like personas and see that they used to have business travelers or high-end travelers. But because the share of wallet that a lot of millennials or experience hunters were willing to give to the hospitality industry, they were trying to respond to that shift. So they took that trend and essentially mapped out that persona shift of what they're doing now from the center to what's next, to kind of map out and understand and fill in this picture of who their next buyer is, and then looked at the perspective, which is really about values and your assets. What do we have in our assets that is it, do we have knowledge of the local economy or knowledge of local industries, of restaurants and bars that we can offer to these experience hunters? Is there something inside our space, like a Instagrammable entrance, that we can sort of shift to address? Is it the type of employees we hire? How does the world see us? And should we consider bringing in some adjacencies? And then when it comes to process, taking again this hospitality industry, how do we make that bring that local feel to these experience hunters that are looking for a higher design hotel? So we looked at just fragmentation of where there might be disconnects between the staff and the local offerings in town. We also just saw so that's with frontline, exposing frontline and gatekeepers to the changes that were happening and getting their input, and then changing just the entire process of how we would onboard customers so that we could address this experience market, not just the business travelers. And then finally, product, like what is it that you're offering? What are we best at already? What are we worst at? What are we envious of? Who are we, if it's an Ace Hotel that's doing this really well, what can we learn from them? And does this offering leverage where we're located, or other kind of questions that you should consider? So this is just a list of questions that you should consider as you're making shifts. So we look at personas, perspectives, process, and products, and really map out those shifts and understand where they're happening and how they affect these other quadrants.
Great.
So we've talked about pivoting and innovating. So what is a stakeholder and why should we engage with them? So a stakeholder is any person, organization, or group or society at large that has a vital interest in a business or its activities. So this can be an internal group. We sometimes overlook our employees, and they might be critical to a change. We were talking actually yesterday in preparation for this about how when whether it's Amazon or a grocery store or dispensary, when you're asking employees to come along on this shift and come along into this new world with you, how they are just really key in your communication and in your engagement, because you need them to be wearing masks, but they might be getting their information from all different sources. So it's really key to engage them in this shift that's happening. So we'll get to the prioritization earlier, but I just wanted to highlight that it's not just external stakeholders. We often only look externally, but it can be internal. And it can be both affected by and affected business. And I think that in this case with COVID, we are being both affected by and affecting businesses. Yeah, Meryl,
and back to your point with, when the communication around the mask, right? So here's this dilemma, right? As the employer, you might not even have access to getting masks to provide them, right? So how do you make this cultural shift with empathy and saying, okay, well, what can we do, right? So, making it, giving them direction on how to provide their own in the short term, right, until you can acquire them for them, giving them, if they can't provide it themselves, finding alternatives to where some of these ones are. Maybe it is, we would talk about the cross engagement here, but maybe it is calling some of those suppliers and some of those brands who have the bandanas and say, hey, we need them. Can you send, some over to us? And then, have the little workshop of how to put them together, whether it's with hair ties or whatever, right? So, it's taking out the fear and putting in, hey, we're all in this together, right? Because that's the messaging that you want when you are asking people right now to go outside of their safety zone to engage with the public, when everything is very unsettling. And so, we are definitely seeing this in the news across the country when it does not work well for the employees and when it is working well, right? Those that really, when we stand outside and we're, clapping for our first responders, but we're also doing it and recognizing that, wow, those people that stock our shelves in our grocery stores are really important people, and seeing these people for the first time and giving them the respect that they deserve. So it's really, it's been an amazing engagement that we have not prepared for. So it ties so much into how we have to think differently at each of the ways that we get connect with people in our companies and outside it.
Yeah. So let's be very clear then about that a stakeholder is really internal or external or both affected by and affect a business. Okay, reasons why we do this in the first place, kind of spoke to this a lot, but let's just be explicit. Stakeholders can be gatekeepers, so it's important to engage with them if they're making decisions that impact your business. You can garner early buy-in or promoters from engaging with your stakeholders, and it could be critical to your success. It decreases blind spots to engage with stakeholders. It can be a source of information or evidence that de-risks the future. And it may reveal something that is possible or unknown at this time when you engage with your stakeholders. So especially coming from an innovation point of view, where in a big company trying to understand the future, we went to that open laboratory of startups to reveal something new and unknown to us at that time. All right, so we're going to jump into the exercises now and start with identifying your stakeholders. So here's some examples of common stakeholders in the cannabis industry, but some of these kind of go across all different industries. So these are here for you to take a look at. So I'll give everyone a second to kind of ingest that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then we're going to do an exercise. So we're going to start brainstorming our stakeholders. And hopefully this comes pretty quick to you. The first 5 or 6, you can jot them down right now. I'm going to give everyone the opportunity to do that. And while you start jotting these down, I'm going to ask some questions so that you can, really let your mind expand and start thinking outside the box. Because I'm sure when we look at the examples I shared, yeah, okay, my investors, my employees, my sales channels, okay, my local community maybe you're thinking about, my distributors. So I'm going to ask a few questions just as you're going through this process to inspire some thoughts. So who needs to be involved? Who are the actual users or consumers of the output? Many times we talk about clients or consumers in a B2B interaction or kind of sales channel, but who are the actual users of your service and product, the end users or consumers of the output? Who will most benefit from your project, your idea, your product? That's my favorite question personally. It really helps kind of frame who's actually benefiting from this. And when I would work with startups, that was a question that was very, very revealing, is who most benefits. And it's not always the target market. It could be a kind of a secondary beneficiary. Who are the key decision makers? Who is a gatekeeper of resources? Maybe it's someone that you need approvals from, or that decides that you get this type of packaging or another type of packaging while they have limited supplies. Who will influence the customer experience? Is that a developer on your website? that maybe you're not really thinking about at this moment because they're sort of behind the scenes? Whose buy-in is needed to successfully launch this product? Is it a bud tender? Is it a dispensary? Is it brand ambassadors? Is it weed maps or some other media source? Who is needed to operationalize? Is this a delivery member of your team? Is this a former store manager that you need to pivot into a new role? Who may be threatened? Is there another existing, if you're moving into delivery from dispensary to delivery, are there delivery groups that are threatened? Are there competitors in your space? Are there those in your local community who feel threatened that cannabis is essential while they're sitting out right now and having to stay closed? They might be threatened. Any other people or groups who will influence your project, product, or this shift? Even write family down for this one, or any other groups that you believe will influence a board of directors, associations. So hopefully that inspired some more thoughts. Before we go on to the next step, I would just like to ask, maybe we can put this in the comments, were any of these questions, did they inspire a stakeholder that you had not previously thought about, that you're now putting down on your stakeholder map? And if you could just put that in the comment section.
Hey Ruth, this is Rhiannon. I just wanted to say that one of the things that I'm always reminded of when we do our stakeholder mapping, it's also the neighboring individual. So if you're doing a delivery service, it's not just your customer, it's their neighbor as well, because you're visible to them. If you have any kind of visible presence in the community, it's all of those general community members too. So that's always something that I get reminded of, because my side of the business is more on the inside, behind the scenes. And so it's always a good reminder for those of us on the inside that it's the full community is in, not a first inside the ring stakeholder, but you are interacting with them. They can influence your business. And when you think about, can you affect them and can they affect you? They're definitely in that set.
Great. Yeah, I agree. They may end up being a prioritized stakeholder, they may not be, but it's important to have that consideration on the map. Okay. So I can't see the comments, but if there's any, let me know. If not, we can move on.
I think we can move on.
Okay. So next, we're going to map your stakeholders. And I think sometimes this is covered in the questions, but let's just talk through this a bit and see if it inspires any further thoughts. So we have an ed tech example where you're creating a product for teachers, and you might be very focused on teachers and the school and the administration and the tech team in there. And it's also important to keep in mind who the teacher stakeholders are, that it's the children as one of their stakeholders, the students, and the parents, and that these are stakeholders, kind of secondary stakeholders to you. And when we get into the prioritization and strategy component, and through this next section even, we'll start seeing why it's really important to start mapping this out and seeing where your stakeholders are. You might already have them down, and you can draw a line to them, whatever way you want to keep track. But let's take the time to map our stakeholders. And here's a cannabis example. Let's say you're a cannabis confection company, and a farmer that is supplying the cannabis that goes into your product is one of your stakeholders. You could map out that the local jurisdiction is one of their stakeholders, and seed suppliers are one of their stakeholders. And this will come into play when you start thinking about the levers you have and the engagement. So if your cannabis farmer is shut down because of local jurisdictions right now, you are impacted by your stakeholders. And so again, not always that these are people you're affecting, but that also affects you. All right, so so go ahead and take some time to do that. I'm going to just move on and explain who are your non-obvious stakeholders. So we're thinking about who are stakeholders that COVID has forced upon you. So the farmer and the local jurisdiction, maybe you had never thought about that before as a confection company, but maybe you had, but maybe it's now a new relationship. So who also most benefits from your product? I think I can't emphasize enough how if you just keep going back to that question, new ideas will come forward. And I think that's a question you should ask yourself every week or every month, especially during these changes that are happening. But who are your non-obvious stakeholders? And I'll just share an example of a dynamic that happened a few years ago when Uber and Lyft were facing heavy regulations, particularly on the thumbprint that would have, kind of slowed down their growth, and they were trying to engage with different stakeholders. The National Governors Association was one of the major stakeholders for Uber and Lyft because they were trying to pass statewide regulations that would allow them to continue serving their consumers. So first we have the dynamic of Uber and Lyft being competitors and therefore each other's stakeholders. And they realized they were both shared stakeholders of the National Governors Association. In thinking about their non-obvious stakeholders, they found that the American Association of People with Disabilities was one of their biggest beneficiaries. These are people who, whether it's sight or hearing or movement, they were limited in how they got from place to place. And Uber and Lyft was just a game changer for them, a life changer. And so they became huge supporters of Uber and Lyft once they were asked. There was a large segment that was benefiting from the service. And so Uber and Lyft realized that this American Association of People with Disabilities was also a major influencer and stakeholder of the National Governors Association. So they created a engagement strategy to bring these groups together and to really make clear to one of their stakeholders that they could all work together to kind of align and find some common goals. So this is just an example of some non-obvious stakeholders that can also be beneficiaries of your product. And I'll just pause here and say, as we think about some examples, again, in the cannabis industry, one that I had thought about was this move to virtual gyms. And we'll talk about this in the next section next week. But one of the strategies that many brands had employed to engage new users of cannabis was to go to where they're at today, to go to the yoga studios or to the Barry's boot camp and to introduce products there. And actually, the gyms and the studios benefited from this because it gave them a point of differentiation in a market that's really competitive, or was competitive, is the studio, the boutique studio. And by having these special classes where people walked away with discounts or products or just a really special, interesting, and intriguing experience, they would fill up their classes more. So now as we make this shift and we know that these studios were benefiting from the brand ambassadors that were going out and engaging and making their classes more interesting, how can we do that now? So is it that the brand ambassadors are delivering products with the virtual class alongside them? So they'll pre-schedule, just like there's the wine tastings happening right now. But again, this is part of thinking through who are your non-obvious stakeholders, who are the beneficiaries, how can you formalize some of those relationships? So hopefully that inspired some thoughts about who your stakeholders are, and you're looking at either a big piece of paper or a slide or however way it's happening in your mind. Maybe you're looking at 20 different stakeholders right now, and you're like, great, that this is a lot of people I can potentially engage. This, I could go a lot of directions with this, and that's great because I think it can inform your strategy going forward. However, we know that when you have too many things going on. You got to focus your efforts. And so when you're making a change, it's really important to prioritize your stakeholders before they prioritize you. And I can say from experience, I've dealt with this a number of times. I'll give you an example. When I was running AT&T's Corporate Innovation Center, we had a lot of stakeholders, internal and external. We had a lot of beneficiaries. And one of those beneficiaries was the sales team. The AT&T sales team loved to bring in other enterprises to receive presentations and just kind of make the sort of argument of, hey, we're innovating, and it really helped them close some deals. And so I think there's a really great benefit of the AT&T Foundry to our company. However, the sales team was not one of our prioritized stakeholders. And as we sat down and looked at how much time and resources we were giving them, we realized that we were spending 20 to 25% of our time sometime giving them presentations or helping them close deals. And this was not one of our prioritized stakeholders. And so we sat back down and we said, we need to prioritize our stakeholders before they prioritize us. And once we did that, we were able to constantly go back to this list and say, you know, sales team, you're not one of our prioritized stakeholders. I realize that we're really helping you. Let's figure out some other ways we can do that in an efficient way. And we wouldn't have gotten to that place if we didn't have this list. And I'll give one more example. When you have employees who are often looking at shiny objects, we all have people like this on our teams. Maybe we are that person ourselves, and they want to talk to everybody. They want to talk to everybody in the ecosystem. They're like, oh no, this is the type of customer we need to engage with. Let's say it's veterans, and on the surface, it's like, oh, I can't argue with that. Like, of course we got to engage with veterans. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you're spending 30-40% of your time with this stakeholder group. And so the prioritization here is just so key to keeping everyone focused. It doesn't mean you can't engage with other stakeholders, but as you move forward, this is a really key component to having success and decision-making and keeping everyone aligned. So I'm going to show you 3 methods to prioritize your stakeholders. And just think about, as I go through this, I'll explain how they're best used, but think about that you can also use more than one. In particular, I think if you have a 2-sided platform, you can first use the tiers of the graphs and then use the 2-sided platform method to make sure there's some balance. So first with tiers, so this is really kind of the most straightforward. When you look at a generic project, you can figure out pretty quickly who's essential to this coming into fruition. It's people who are operationalizing. It could be people who are gatekeepers. Who is essential to get this done? It could be a core team, and put some people in that, or some stakeholders in that grouping. And then important. So who's important to move this through? And then there's interesting. So with the veterans example, that could be, oh, this is really interesting. We could do something here. It could bring us some great PR. There's an interesting story there. Maybe there's some alignment, but they're not essential to the change. Or they could be essential to the change if you're deciding we are only making joints for veterans now because they are an underserved group. We're only making masks for veterans because they're an underserved group. So I just keep using that example because it's not PC to push back on that, but it's business, it's your product, it's important, even when something sounds on the surface like you can't push back to prioritize. And then we have the proof of concept tiers. So this is about phases and about trialing.
You might need to go through and just say what those are, because again, I think they might be hidden behind us. I'm not sure if that's what other people are seeing as well.
So yeah, it basically says,
me.
Yeah, it says phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 on the right hand side. So it's just numbered phases. And so if you think about a proof of concept that you're creating, and maybe there's a policymaker or decision maker that comes at the end of the process. At the beginning of the process, there's nothing for them to decide on. because there's no proof of concept there. It's important to put them in phase 3. And so it doesn't mean they're less important if you're using this tier. It just means in the order of operations, you need your phase 1 stakeholders to get something done, whether that's a product that you're taking from the joints, the mini joints, changing a flavor, but you're doing some kind of trial. It could be a technology based proof of concept, like a new website. So who is essential in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3? So this is one system you can use to prioritize your stakeholders. This is the graph. So you can put anything on the axes, but I just use the example here that I think is most common. Who is high influence in this product or project or this change that's happening, and then you have who is high contact, who requires hand holding, high touch, white glove, whatever phrase you use. So if you start thinking about this, start plotting your stakeholders into this graph and think one by one. Okay, I have a high amount of contact with some of my delivery professionals. So, okay, let's high contact, but they are low influence. So you might want to put them in that bottom right corner. And then I love to put this CEO example here, because while if you're making an internal change inside a business, while a CEO inside the business is a key stakeholder for the business, they may not be a prioritized stakeholder for your project. So if you're doing something within a particular line of business that you have the autonomy to execute on, or there's someone else that is the decision maker, I just like to show here that while the CEO inside a business is a stakeholder that's key, they may not require contact or may not have a high influence, might have a medium influence on your product. So you wouldn't want to put them as a priority stakeholder, because there are likely other stakeholders that have a greater effect on the success of the shift you're trying to make throughout. So this is something to be mindful of. So this is the graph. And then once you're balancing stakeholders in a two-sided platform, and just so we're clear, a two-sided platform is something like an Uber or a Lyft. It's in the case of cannabis, it's Ease and Sava and these companies that depend on the supply and demand to be balanced and to match. And so within a two-sided platform business, you're constantly on the supplier side and on the demand side trying to create business development and engagement on both sides. So you even think about Airbnb, they have a two-sided platform. So they're having engagement on the supply side, onboarding new homes, and then on the other side, trying to onboard and create demand from consumers of their service. So I just put a few up here for what that will look like for a delivery company as an example. So you have delivery drivers on one side and dispatchers and all those associated with supply. And then on the other side, you have the demand stakeholders. So as you're prioritizing your stakeholders, if you're realizing that your whole prioritization list is just full of the supply side or demand side, then it's not going to work. So it's important to keep this big picture in mind if you are a two-sided platform, to balance out your prioritized stakeholders so that you're not putting 100% of your focus on the demand side and then falling short on supply, or totally beefing up your supply side and not looking at generating or engaging with the stakeholders on your demand side. So with that, I just want to, I know we are almost at the end of our time. So I want to ask everyone to rank and prioritize 3 to 4 other stakeholder groups. So based on how you're going to apply one of these prioritization models, you'll have to go ahead and pick 3 to 4. And then we're just going to send everyone home with a little bit of homework before the next section. So when we come back, make sure to have your 3 or 4 prioritized stakeholders. And some things we want you to think about are what motivates, we're just putting in your idea right now, but it could be your business, your product. What motivates your ideas, prioritize stakeholders, and what does your idea do to meet the needs of your prioritized stakeholders? And so we have just a little consideration for you. So I'm just going to explain what a functional driver is, an emotional driver is, and then I'll give you kind of a template to start brainstorming within. So a functional driver or motive is a tangible need that a stakeholder has. And so I'll give you some examples of that in a second, but it's really like, I need this product to do my own job. I need this service to get from place to place. So it's the tangible need that your stakeholder has. If it's something like a decision maker, maybe they need money, they need resources, they need approvals. That's a functional need. Emotional drivers, what is that emotional or intangible need that a stakeholder audience would consider when they're assessing their relationship? Do you make them look cool? Do you make them feel needed? Do you give them some kind of in on what's happening in the industry? Do you kind of provide them with some peace of mind? What is the intangible need, the emotional driver that you give your stakeholder? Is it with the farmers that they feel that they're part of your team? That's not a functional driver, that's an emotional driver. And so start thinking about how your idea will deliver or satisfy these functional and emotional needs of your stakeholders. So this is the take-home exercise. Again, I gave some examples of functional drivers. You can create one of these really just easy T-shape, do it whatever way you want. Put at the top, my stakeholder is, a cannabis farmer. My stakeholder is my delivery driver, my employees, and start listing your functional drivers. Okay, the products, if it's a consumer, staying within budget, if it's someone within your business, communication. And then on an emotional driver, it could be recognition, it could be trust. And sometimes it's both. So I share this example of a functional driver being communication. They might quite literally need communication to do their job. Or it could be both, or it could be that if you think hard about it, actually it's an emotional driver. They like being in the loop. They want to be in the loop. It feels really good for like a weed maps, it's a functional and an emotional driver for them to be communicated to and be in the loop, because it's one way you can help them deliver is to communicate with them. So think about how you deliver to that need. So with that, eventually this is what a synthesized finding of your stakeholder statements looks like. So we'll get to that next time. But I think, we're really gonna just take a break here and get to part 2 next Tuesday. So with that, I don't know if Meryl, you want to wrap things up.
Yeah, so I think this was a great introduction, and I think that you touch on so many different ways in which we get so caught up looking just here and not out here, right? All these different things that are affecting us, but more importantly, what does it affect our business? How does it affect our brand? How does it affect our engagement? And this is great foundational work. I think you brought up some excellent examples that are relevant not only to just recent past, but going forward. I think the wine tasting, virtual wine tasting is such a good example, because as you think, what are my services or what am I going to offer going forward? If I can't personally be in front of you, how am I going to get something to you? And then also create an experience where you get to kind of still join in, even though we're not in the same room, right? So, the wine tasting of, I, purchased these 4 different wines, and, this group that I know is going to do the same, and then we all get on and we get to do our own tasting. I mean, we're seeing this with cooking, because we're all cooking at home, and we're seeing this with chefs that, all of a sudden don't have their restaurants, but it's like, hey, maybe I can teach you at home how to make X, right? And so you know, we're engaging in different ways, and this is such a good setup and beginning first part.
Yeah, I
to
think
start that.
I think it'll be really cool for everyone to see the engage your stakeholders strategies and really bring this to life. And I think we've previewed that in this first conversation. But again, it's important to eat your Brussels sprouts before getting into the really fun part, so that as you're thinking about these strategies that you can kind of put in place, you can think about it creatively and strategically and have all the information in front of you. So please do the pre-work, the understanding your stakeholder audiences, and come back. We'll go through that, and then we'll talk about engaging stakeholders.
And just for the people that are, you know, in this group, but also, you know, going out, we will put this out. We'll share this, you know, with all of our networks. They'll be able to access it. You'll be able to private message us with any questions or thoughts, or if you need some of these worksheets, so we can provide them to you. But, you know, even if you hadn't been on this call, you will have all of this information ahead of time, so that, you know, you can join us on Tuesday when we pick this back up and really start to put an action plan together of how this works. And it's going to be pretty exciting and a lot of fun. So we don't want people to stress about it. We want them to find it challenging in the same way that you do a game, and not as, oh no, something that, you know, I have to win at, right?
Yeah.
So fantastic. Thank you so much. We're so pleased with everyone that could join us, and we will be back on Tuesday, and we'll look forward to it.
Yeah. See everyone then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.